These people, Ben, want us to abandon the most successful economic model to the extent it's been tried, capitalism, and they want us to do this, to abandon capitalism for what? For something that they cannot even define.
There's no reason to think that once you use the state to smash private property, to run the economy on behalf of the workers, that somehow it would just relinquish power through some kind of magical means. When something like the Soviet Union runs the economy in the way that it does, we need a concept to describe that and to distinguish it from capitalism. If the Soviet Union isn't socialist, wasn't socialist, then nothing actually is, because nothing else fits any definition that anybody's ever offered.
Socialism has failed every time it's been tried, across decades, across countries, and across cultures. From Russia to East Germany, from China to Cuba, the result is always the same: tyranny and economic collapse. So why isn't socialism in the dustbin of history? Here's one reason. Every time a socialist regime fails, its defenders insist that was not real socialism. Soviet Union was not real socialism. China, Venezuela, same excuse, not real socialism. Yet when the next experiment begins, they cheer it on, they say, oh, this time it will work, until it fails, and then they will tell us the usual trope. That wasn't socialism either. But today, on the Ayn Rand Institute's podcast, with my colleague Ben Bayer, we will debunk the myth that real socialism has never been tried. We will show you why the Soviet Union, the first socialist state, was actually real socialism, and why its failure, together with the failure of every socialist regime, is inevitable. So Ben, as an author put it, socialism is the failed idea that never dies. This is a book by Christian Nimitz, which actually makes a lot of references to these people who every time say, this time it will be different, and then they say, oh, but this was not real socialism. So let us see some facts, Ben, on socialism's appeal, which is still alive despite all its failures.
Yes, as recently as 2023, the Fraser Institute in Canada put together an opinion poll, and they polled Canadians, Australians, British, and Americans about what was the ideal social system. And just leave aside everyone but the Americans for the time being, 43% of Americans between ages 18 and 34, according to this Fraser Institute poll, think that socialism is an ideal economic system. Now, as people get older, the level of support drops off. So with 32%, only 32% between ages 35 and 54, down to then 19% when you're 55 or older. I should mention that data does not include the people who say that communism is the ideal social system. So the support is even higher at those, especially at those younger ages. And one thing to note about this data is that the pollers also asked people what they meant by the term socialism, and different people meant different things, and that may in fact account for why they end up supporting it or not. The more popular definition of socialism among the people who were asked is simply government provision of services or government provision of some kind of minimum income. And the least popular definition is government ownership of the means of production, which, as we're going to argue today, is actually the correct definition. So it's kind of a cliche that the older you are, the more likely you are to prefer capitalism and oppose socialism. Turns out the data bears it out, but part of the reason for this might be that not just the cliche reason. The cliche reason is that, oh, the older you are, the more money you make, the more you want to hold on to it. But this data suggests it may also be just that the younger people know less about the actual meaning of the concept. And that's part of why they support it. Now, I think that's not the only factor. There is also the factor of younger people being more likely to stand up for what they think is a moral ideal. In this case, it would be a false moral ideal. But we do need to think about what is the actual correct definition of the concept of socialism. And definitions, I don't think, are just arbitrary. They don't just come down to us from the clouds. We get them by identifying what unites key instances, key examples of a concept, where we see a cluster of similarities. We need to form a concept, and then we figure out what defines that cluster of similarities. And I think one way of thinking about this, Nikos, is, well, if we're not going to use the USSR, the Soviet Union, as our example of socialism to start with, it's going to be pretty unclear. If that's not socialism, what else is? It's not clear what else would be, and that'll be something something we're going to explore today. So we should talk about the Soviet Union, which I take to be a paradigm example.
So Ben, let me just tell you what the Soviet Constitution mentions, and we can see there where they mean what they say or not. According to the Soviet Constitution, the foundation of the economic system of the USSR is socialist ownership of the means of production in the form of state property belonging to all the people and collective farm and cooperative property. And then, still in the Article 10 of the Constitution, no one has the right to use socialist property for personal gain or other selfish ends. And then they tell us again in the next article, Article 11, the state owns the basic means of production. So the way they see socialism is that the productive process is controlled and owned by the people. Now, who is the people? The people are represented, let's say, by the workers' state. And at the same time, it is a society which is not based on capitalist principles, which means there is no free market and you do not work for your own personal profit. So this is how Soviet Union sees itself. And these, Ben, are not just words. They actually meant it. Soviet Union and every other socialist society, indeed, they abolished the market, and indeed, they tried to socialize the means of production, which in practice, it means that the state owned the means of production. They would put it as the working class owns it, because in their eyes, the state, the party, and the working class are one.
Yeah, now, of course, nobody disputes that the Soviet Union had extensive state ownership, and nobody disputes that they called themselves socialist. I mean, it's right there in the name, Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. The question is, and the question that people debate about is, does the fact that they called themselves this mean that that's what they really were? How do we know that they really meant it, as you put it? How do we know they weren't just gangsters who decided to call themselves socialist because of the perceived moral superiority that it would give them? And so, Nikos, you know a lot more about the history of communism and the history of the Soviet Union than I do. So what can you tell us about just the ideological motivations of the founders of the Soviet Union?
Well, there are two stories that come to mind, Ben, to my mind, that actually show that these people were devoted ideologues. First of all, forget the stories. We have access these days to all the files with all the discussions of the inner circle. And we know that these people, any decision they took, they had to at least rationalize it based on Marxist principles. So even when they were talking behind closed doors, they saw themselves and they saw what they were doing as this historical mission of applying the theories of Marxism in real life. But let me get back to the two examples, which for me are very telling. There is a point in the early years of Soviet Union under Stalin, where the country is desperate to have a proper official recognition from the Great Britain. But at the same time, there is a strike by coal miners in England, and the Soviet Union, of course, as any proper state that would see itself as a Marxist-Leninist state does, actually helps in international solidarity the British workers. So at a great diplomatic cost, at the cost of prematurely breaking down any negotiation with Great Britain, the Soviets preferred to lose money, to lose the opportunity to do trade with a big country, rather than betray their principles as Marxist-Leninist. So there's no question for Soviet Union that always applying Marxist-Leninism and the duty of a good Marxist, which is international solidarity, among other things, comes first. Ideology comes first. And there's another example. You will see in the 1930s, again under Stalin, Soviet Union actually going in the middle of nowhere in the wilderness and building from nothing industrial cities. And the idea was very simple. According to Marx, we are impacted by the way that economy is run. And in order to be a proper worker, a proper proletariat, you have to be surrounded, let's say, by factories, because this will give you a proper proletarian consciousness. This is an application, in very simple terms, of the Marxist idea of that your consciousness is impacted by the economy. So the Soviets would build cities out of nowhere, and sometimes without much economic reason behind it, just so they see their country following the Marxist steps, that we have to be an industrial society, therefore, at a tremendous cost, let's build these huge industrial cities so that we also produce people with a proper consciousness, the consciousness of a worker, the consciousness of an industrial proletariat who will then be a proper communist. So they thought, if we leave people working in the countryside, they will not have the proper consciousness. But if we move them in these artificial great cities, like Magnitogorsk, for example, they will become proper, they will get the proper consciousness. Now, if you know anything about Marx, this is fanatical Marxism. This is centrally planning, not just an economy, but centrally planning human beings according to the Marxist dogma. So it is very clear to me that Soviet Union was an ideological society, that the builders of that country, the founding fathers and the people who took the decisions in that country, at least they were thinking that in every step they were following the ideology of Marxism.
And that certainly sounds like Marx's theory of dialectical materialism in practice for anyone who's studied it. And I mean, if Marxism isn't an ideology behind socialism, I don't know what is. But I mean, how would you respond to the, in effect, the Marxist nerd who says, yeah, but according to Marx, socialism, communism have to emerge out of capitalism, and they never had that in the Soviet Union, and so this couldn't really be what Marx wanted?
Yeah, well, I'm more of a Marxist nerd than they are, so I have an answer for that. So it is true that throughout his life, Marx is not very clear on whether a country can skip a stage of development and go straight from feudalism to socialism or to communism. But particularly when it comes to Russia, Marx gave us a very clear answer. And he did this only 2 years before he died. So no one can tell us, oh, this was a not mature Marx. So in 1881, Marx writes a letter to a Russian radical called Vera Zazulits, and Zazulits asks him simply if Russia can skip capitalism and go straight from feudalism to communism. And Marx says, yes, actually, Russia can't do so. But let's not get too preoccupied with theory, Ben. We have examples of other countries, not Soviet Union, other countries who tried to implement socialism after they already had experience with capitalism. So these countries followed the proper, let's say, the proper recipe that Marx gave: feudalism, capitalism, socialism. And I'm talking about countries like Hungary, countries like Czechoslovakia, countries like Germany, actually East Germany. And what we see in all of these countries is that the failure of socialism was as abysmal as it was in Soviet Union. So whatever the problem in Soviet Union, it was not that it didn't follow the proper recipe of historical materialism. A, because Marx said that the country could, in some particular cases, skip this process. And number two, because we view the same results in other countries that actually follow the Marxist the Marxist order of things.
I think the more likely response, the much more popular one, especially if you're talking about the Soviet Union, because I think everyone knows just how brutal conditions were under the Soviet Union. The typical booster of socialism is going to say, we know that couldn't have been real socialism because Stalin, who was responsible for so much of the brutality, was really just a power luster. He was really just trying to ingratiate himself, enrich himself. How do you respond to that?
Well, my response to that is this is a huge myth that Stalin somehow was not a proper Marxist. We know many things about Stalin. He's one of the most studied people in human history. And we know that Stalin was actually an ideologue. And there is no doubt that Stalin was a true believer in communism. Stalin, throughout his life, was deeply immersed in Marxism. We have a quote by someone who knew him when he was in exile in 1908, so before he became famous. And he said about this exiled man, who was Stalin, that if you pricked his head, the whole of Karl Marx's capital would come hissing out of it like a gas from a container. So from a very early age, Stalin lives and breathes Marxism. And also, let's remember, Stalin was not just a thug. He was also an intellectually active man throughout his life, and including the time when he was in power. His personal library contained some 20,000 books, and he was a ferocious reader throughout, again, his life. But let's also remember, Ben, Stalin was an author of important theoretical works. He's the author of theoretical works which are considered contributions to knowledge in the Marxist canon. And an example is his work, Marxism and the National Question. And here's an interesting fact. In his first decade in power, Stalin actually offered his resignation from his position as general secretary 7 times to his colleagues. 7 times he went, I quit, for various reasons that are not relevant now. And every single time, the rest of the Central Committee, actually, they decline his resignation. And there's a reason for that. And the reason is that his peers knew that Stalin was the only one who had the stomach to spill the blood that needed to be spilled for the most important step towards the socialist transformation of Soviet Union. And this was the forced collectivization of agriculture, a process which ended up costing the lives of more than 5 million people. Now, again, let's see why this is a step very much in tune with Marxism. What does Marxism say? Marxism says that what gives the character of a society is not who holds the power in terms of who has political power. For Marxism, and for every proper Marxist will agree with that, the economic base of a society determines or influences to a large extent whether this country is a socialist country or a capitalist country. So, as a devoted Marxist, Stalin knew that you cannot have a socialist country with tens of millions of semi-free farmers engaging in market-type trade, which was the case in Soviet Union before the late 20s. So Stalin said, we have to collectivize agriculture, which means we have to basically enslave tens of millions of farmers. He knew very well that this would have a tremendous cost in lives. He knew that this was mostly a warlike operation against his own population. And yet he did it. He enslaved tens of millions of farmers, he persecuted, he exiled, he starved and killed millions more. But by doing so, he made the Soviet economy a proper socialist economy. And his peers knew that it would take all this blood to be spilled. They knew that this was the right Marxist choice to do, and they knew that Stalin was a true Marxist, and therefore he would do it. He did it, and of course, the result was one of the biggest humanitarian tragedies in human history.
So Nikos, again, nobody denies Stalin did those things, or that his supporters wanted him to. I guess the question that someone's going to ask is, how is it consistent with socialism to do that? Socialism is supposed to deliver us a worker's paradise, not a bloodbath. What is your argument for why this kind of brutality has to come out of the theory that the Marxists were preaching?
Well, it has to come out because in socialist states like Soviet Union, they are not dictatorships by accident. The oppression is not a bug of socialism, it's a feature. And here's why. In socialism, the common good is put above the individual self-interest. So under socialism, the reason everyone works is for the good of society, allegedly. Now, actually not allegedly, they believe it. But how can you know what is good for society? Then you need to have a group of people who will decide what is good for society, who will decide what society needs. And therefore, you will have to produce based on the decrees of these central planners. It is impossible to have socialism without central planning, because then we go back to what they consider the chaos of the market. So let's say, Ben, that we allow a factory to have workers' democracy, which is what Marx told us that socialism really means. So let's say a factory votes and they say, we want to produce butter. But the central planners or the council of all workers says that this factory needs to produce milk. What is the factory to do? If they go on producing what its workers want to produce, they make the central planning obsolete. But then what type of socialism do you have? Then you have a different type of, you go back to some form of market. And we know that for Marxists, this is not the case. So how could it be that you can have freedom of production, producers producing what they want, and at the same time having some central command of the economy? And the Marxists here, Ben, will evade in every possible way. I remember a discussion I had some years ago with a Marxist, with someone who was deeply serious on Marx, on reading and understanding Marx. And I told him, do you think that we should nationalize Apple? Because he was someone who appreciated technology. And he said, no, Apple should not be state-owned, it should not be nationalized, but it should be socialized. And then I kept pushing and pushing him literally for hours. What does socializing mean, and how is it different from nationalizing? How can you have social control of the means of production if it's not, at the end of the day, state control of the means of production, which is what we had in Soviet Union and in every other socialist country? And guess what? He had no answer. So at the end of the day, Ben, my claim is you cannot have socialism without some form of central planning. And you cannot have some sort of central planning without authoritarianism, because central planning means that you produce what you're told to produce. And it even means you live where you're told to live, because you cannot have central planning and free migration, because if we expect that there's going to be 50,000 workers, let's say in Texas, but then 20,000 of them move to California, there goes the central plan. And this is why, for example, in Soviet Union, you had the system of internal passports. People could not move even within the country. And this is why eventually they built the wall in East Germany. Because again, you cannot have central planning and letting people go wherever they want.
Yeah, I think this is a really important point. And whether you call the central planning or the central planners the state or not, bracket that for a moment, we'll come back to it. It's the thing that socialism requires, and it's the thing that's at the root of all of the brutality that the supporters of socialism would really like to disassociate themselves from. I mean, think about every major aspect here. The being able to decide what gets made by whom, that command and control over the economy, over production. That means power over life and death. It means, I mean, first of all, to get the whole thing started, you have to have a revolution. You have to take the property away from the people who created it and earned it from the capitalists. And so there's your first, there's the birth in bloodbath, the violent revolution, which also, by the way, nobody disputes that Marx called for. I mean, workers of the world unite. It was all about having a revolution. And then once the revolution's happened, if you want to have central planning, if you want to control the economy in a allegedly scientific way, you have to outlaw all the voluntary transactions that would otherwise take place. You get a black market. If you want to quash the black market, you've got to have a kind of surveillance state. You've got to have secret police to make sure people aren't doing the voluntary trading of private property that they're not supposed to do. And that, of course, then leads to a whole layer of violence. But then you encounter the problem that, of course, central planning of the kind socialists want to do doesn't actually work, doesn't actually produce. It leads to poverty and stagnation. And then you have a lot of people objecting to the policy. But then the state or the central planners, whatever you want to call them, they need to maintain power and they need to put down dissent. And so, again, you need another layer of propaganda and censorship to control information so that people don't know that it's failing. You need to have, as you mentioned, stop emigration because people might want to leave such a system and then you won't have any workers. So you need to build like the Berlin Wall. You need to have party purges. You need to have more secret police. And then at the end of the day, I think ultimately all forms of collectivism involve this, not just socialism, but when the system fails, you need to have somebody else you can blame for it. You need to be able to blame external infiltrators and conspirators, and especially if you can blame foreign enemies to make your state look legitimate, to look like the victim of these conspirators, and therefore you end up pouring all kinds of unnecessary resources into unnecessary military buildups. You support foreign invasions and insurgencies like in Czechoslovakia and Hungary and Cuba and Vietnam and Ethiopia and Afghanistan and wherever around the world the Soviet Union was supporting its allies against the alleged enemies who were allegedly working to ruin the Soviet experiment, the socialist experiment. And Nikos, you'll hear a lot of people say, well, socialism's good in theory, but it doesn't work in practice. But something you highlighted a few moments ago, I think helps bring out that, well, what it is in theory is this form of collectivism, is the idea that the individual is nothing. The individual has to subordinate himself to the greater good, to the proletariat, whatever you want to call it. Well, and if that's what you really think, then what that logically implies in practice is the kind of brutality and control and war and bloodshed that we've just been talking about. And yet, Nikos, nevertheless, people deny that any of this is socialism. And I think the only trick they have left at the end of the day is simply to redefine socialism to mean something other than state ownership of the means of production. And what's the trick they usually use to do this redefinition?
Yeah, first of all, I think you're too kind with them. Redefine would imply that they actually give a definition of what socialism is. But what happens is that socialists do not give any indication of what real socialism will look like. Instead of some clear defining characteristic, we get these blurry slogans. They say, for example, socialism means workers' control and democracy in the workplace. But again, what does this mean? The United States has, let's say, a labor force of 170 million people. How can they democratically organize production? Who will be doing what and by what standard? And how can you have workers' control in a centrally planned economy? We already covered this. What if the workers in the factory want to produce microchips, but the central planner wants them to produce radios? And socialists have no answer to these questions. And Ben, they've had all the time in the world to provide answers, because these are questions that have been posed for decades, and they have nothing. They have nothing. And I'm not even asking here for a detailed manual, because again, a Marxist will say, well, in communism, there will be different ways of producing, and this will impact your consciousness in a particular way. So only then you'll figure out what communism will be like. But I'm not even asking for something very detailed. I'm asking for some basic blueprint, some blueprint of working principles, and I've never gotten any. These people, Ben, want us to abandon the most successful economic model to the extent it's been tried, capitalism, and they want us to do this, to abandon capitalism for what? For something that they cannot even define. And what the socialists engage is a sort of intellectual fraud. They tend to define the phenomenon by its outcomes. They say, for example, socialism is workers' control and prosperity. In USSR, there was no prosperity and workers did not feel in control. Therefore, it wasn't real socialism. This is like saying real alchemy is turning cheap metals into gold. Now, those who tried to do alchemy didn't manage to turn metals into gold, and therefore it was not real alchemy. Of course, they cannot tell you how you can turn cheap metals into gold. So they cannot tell us what real alchemy is. So at the end of the day, what socialists resort to is, trust me, next time it will be different. And I find this infuriating. Like, this time the workers will have actual control over production. Like, really, people, do socialists really think that no one has ever thought of that before? No socialist in the 20-something times that socialism has been tried, no one thought that, oh, maybe we should give workers control? Do socialists really believe that every dictator, that Stalin or Castro or Mao, do they think all these people who spend their whole lives trying to read and understand and fight for Marxism, do they think that they started out with the aspiration, oh yeah, let's just create a huge bureaucracy and let's oppress people? Actually, even Lenin envisioned a state that would eventually wither away. Actually, forget Lenin. Even Stalin, if you read his work before he comes to power, he agrees with Marx and Lenin that yes, one day the state will wither away. So once more, Ben, what socialists try very hard not to see, what they are evading, is that authoritarianism and coercion are features in socialism. They are not bugs. So there cannot be any other type of socialism. Socialism will always be authoritative. It will always be coercive.
Yeah, I think your parallel to alchemy is very telling, that the attempt to define socialism as a kind of workers' paradise is akin to defining it as a kind of alchemy. And the trouble is that there is no such thing as alchemy. There is no mechanism by which alchemy could work. And one of the things I stressed earlier is that definitions don't just come from the sky, that we need them to give identity to the concepts that we form to describe real similarities and differences in the world. And if you're looking around for a cluster of things that are similar to each other in regards to being the workers' paradise, where workers are in control of everything and there's no coercion, there's just nothing in the world that clusters around that idea. If you look to, I mean, maybe the closest that you can think of that would come to that in reality is the various utopian socialist communes that existed in the United States in the 19th century. And surely they were ideologically socialist, but if you are thinking in terms of political organization, if you're thinking a concept for your social system, what they had was something very different from what we had in the Soviet Union. But it was also very different from, but it was also it was within the context of a capitalist system. We had a private capitalist, Robert Owen, who bought some land and set up some factories and paid some people, and then they wrote up very nonsensical rules for how to run these factories. That is still within the context of a private ownership system. Same thing is true for the major example that socialist activists today point to when they want to say, here's an example of where workers' democracy could work. They point to the Mondragon Corporation in Spain, which is a kind of workers' collective. It's owned by workers, but again, under the context of a state that recognizes their property to run this corporation as they do. They sell their products to numerous other capitalist concerns. And again, according to a kind of certain kinds of socialist ideas where they think the workers should be the ones who own it. And I should mention, because of that, they don't function very effectively. And you have recently a lot of the subsidiaries voting to leave because the more productive ones end up having to subsidize the less productive ones. And so, but again, it's in the context of a capitalist system. They're trying out this experiment. And so those are not actually examples of a different social system than capitalism, which they're supposed to be. And they are not, therefore, examples of socialism, which is supposed to be a different social system from capitalism. And yet we still need a concept to describe the difference between capitalist social systems and the ones where it's not private owners who own the property, but the ones where the state owns the property. We need a concept to designate things like the Soviet Union, the People's Republic of China, Cuba, North Korea, etc. We need a concept to describe this very real difference in social systems in the world, the difference between laissez-faire systems that respect individual rights and state-controlled systems. Well, the concept that we've started to use to describe that is socialism, especially because, as we've discussed, in the actual works of the socialists, there was explicit reference to the idea the state would own these means of production. Now, Marx himself thought that at a certain point the state would wither away magically. Of course, there he's bringing the alchemy into it again. There's no reason to think that once you use the state to smash private property, to run the economy on behalf of the workers, that somehow it would just relinquish power through some kind of magical means. And so it may be that Marx was engaging in the same kind of magical thinking as many of his contemporary supporters do when he said that the state would wither away. But nevertheless, the means that he described to get to that magical outcome is what's actually been implemented. He called it socialism. We call it socialism today. There's just no reason to think that it's not socialism when something like the Soviet Union runs the economy in the way that it does. And we need a concept to describe that and to distinguish it from capitalism. And it goes back to my point. If the Soviet Union wasn't socialist, then nothing actually is, because nothing else fits any definition that anybody's ever offered.
Can I preempt a possible objection here, Ben, that I just thought about? Someone could say, oh yeah, but also you people, you the defenders of free enterprise, let's say, all the time you say, oh, this country is not real capitalist. And for example, you say, oh, this authoritarian regime is not real capitalism. There's a difference, though, because we can actually give a very clear definition of what pure capitalism, what a clear capitalist case of a country would be. And also there's a second point. We can tell which are the capitalist elements in a mixed economy and which are the socialist elements. And we can also see that the closer a country leans towards what we define as capitalism, the more prosperous this country is and the freer this country tends to be. Whereas the closer a country leans towards what we define as socialism, for example, Venezuela, which is not, I wouldn't put it on the same category with Soviet Union, but the closest it leads towards that example, the more tyrannical it is and the most of a basket case of an economy it is. So that's a difference between when we say this is not real capitalism, where when a Marxist says, oh, but this was not real socialism.
Yeah, and it's that gets clear once you realize the meaning of these concepts, that they're concepts used to distinguish two types of social system. One where the state is in control and one where it is limited to the protection of individual rights. And yes, it's true. There's not been pure capitalism in the history of the world. But as you point out, we've gotten close to it. And to the extent those elements have dominated, we've succeeded. But to the extent that the element of state ownership has dominated, and that's the only way to define what socialism is, we've seen death, destruction, catastrophe. Nikos, I think one thing we should wrap up with is to mention that this alternate definition that is used to try to excuse socialism from any association with the crimes of the real socialists of the past, this workers' paradise definition, of course, is just an evasion. It's a rationalization that's used precisely to try to disassociate an idea from its actual consequences in reality. But we shouldn't be surprised by this, because there are so many other things about the socialist outlook that involve similar kinds of evasion of important facts of reality. It's no surprise they're engaging in the same process. So socialism, you mentioned before, the kind of dialectical materialist view that if you build the tools, it will condition the workers' minds. Which is, of course, the exact reverse of the truth, because socialism evades the fact that the root of production is the mind, that the tools have to come from the mind in the first place, from the free choices of a thinker who has to create some value in the world. Socialist ideology evades the fact that it is capitalists who do some of this crucial thinking, that while, of course, there are important contributions by inventors and by scientists, it's the capitalists, and this is something we discussed in a previous episode, Nikos, it's the capitalists who do the first-handed integration of different production factors of supply and demand, and they identify a market, and they create a value, and they create a fit, and they find the financing, and they do the marketing. And that is a unique act of value creation that's possible only to an independent thinker. Socialism evades the fact that individual human beings are the ones who are responsible for the choices that they make over their own lives, that they're not determined or preconditioned by their class or their economic structure. Socialism evades the fact that because of that, they therefore have the right, individuals have the right to seek and to earn property and to pursue happiness, because they need to be the ones who profit from the choices that they make. And that they have every right to do it, and that it's right for them to do it. And of course, most importantly for our purposes, socialism evades the fact that individuals need economic freedom to do all of these things. That they think that central planning is a way that people can actually flourish, when, because of the fact people are individuals, they need to make choices. Their minds need to be free in order to think and produce. So there's just any number of evasions that socialist ideology overall engages in. The fact that they also evade the definition of their own system is no big surprise.
Mm-hmm. So my final word would be, if these people think that Lenin couldn't understand what socialism is, but they understand what socialism is, then I give up. I have nothing else to add to this. Shall we proceed in some sources, Ben?
Yeah, a few things to share here. First of all, this is the Ayn Rand Institute podcast, and so we should start by sharing resources from Ayn Rand herself. If you go to this link, you will find the entry in the Ayn Rand Lexicon under the heading Socialism, where you get the Ayn Rand's essential commentary on what socialism is and why she viewed it as a moral abomination. Next, I wrote an article tackling this very subject we've been discussing today, this dodge, this attempt to redefine socialism to excuse it from its crimes. This is The Dishonesty of Real Socialism Has Never Been Tried, which was published in New Ideal, August 19th in 2020. And Nikos, you've been teaching a course on the history of Marxist thought for the ARU. Did you want to say a word or two about that?
Yes, this is an 8-week course where we cover both the ideas of Marx, the life of Marx, the period in which he lived, what were his influences, the Marxian philosophy, his economics, the way he viewed the capitalism and revolution, but also then we see how these ideas were applied. Soviet Union, under Lenin, under Stalin, China, but also how these ideas played out in the Cold War, so how Marx impacted the course of history. And our focus, particularly when we talk about Soviet Union, is that this is a country that, the way to understand it is, it was a socialist country. It was almost, you can see in every step that it takes, It tries to be loyal to the spirit of Marxism. And this is why it was the political, moral, and economic disaster that it was.
And there's a version of this course starting up again in just a few weeks, correct?
Actually, we are recording in the first week of April. It starts in next week, so we'd be glad to see some people there as auditors.
The people can still sign up. Great. Yeah. If you enjoyed this podcast, please be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel, like, comment, share, or do anything you can to help optimize the algorithm in our favor. Same thing on Facebook, especially if you're watching a recording, leave a comment. And send us an email to newideal@aynrand.org if you have questions, if you have suggestions for future episodes. We read everything that comes in. Thanks for having this conversation with me today, Nikos.
Thank you. Bye-bye.